Steve was my favorite uncle. In holiday gatherings at the family home in Connecticut, he stood out from the rest. He wore a leather jacket and drove a motorcycle, and my brother and I thought he was very cool. And then one day, when I was 8 years old, he disappeared.
Authorities say they want to question the lawyer named Stephen Mitchell Bingham in connection with a gun.
Bingham apparently was the only person to visit George Jackson,
a militant black who was shot dead yesterday while trying to break out of San Quentin.
3 white guards and 2 white inmates were killed, their throats slit. The warden's investigators suspect
Stephen Bingham.
Stephen Bingham.
Stephen Bingham. His grandfather was governor of Connecticut once and a U.S. senator.
There is no way that George Jackson could have obtained the death gun except during his visit with attorney Stephen Bingham.
Police and San Quentin guards held him responsible for the death of prison guards during the George Jackson incident. If he went to prison, his life was in true danger.
It was a Saturday, and I spent the day cooking. I think I was making cabbage borscht. We were listening to music, listening to the radio, and an APB came out that there was this terrible event at San Quentin.
Whether it was Bingham who deliberately smuggled a gun to Jackson through these gates is something that only Stephen Bingham can answer.
And the next thing I know, I'm at the kitchen, and in walks Steve with his motorcycle helmet, takes off his helmet, and says, by kind of as lighthearted as you can be, "Hi, what's for dinner?" And I said, "What are you doing here?" In the next day or two, it became clear to us that he was potentially in great danger.
We developed these ideas that as lawyers, our jobs were, one, to keep the movement on the streets by representing people who were arrested and charged with criminal offenses. We would use the law to expose some of the problems in our society.
We saw the need for the lawyers to be part of the movement, not just the counselors to the movement. And the young people coming out of law school saw their role as activist professionals.
Steve was one of the people who said that I'm not going to simply run for office. I'm not going to be the white man who is going to tell folks what to do. I'm going to commit myself to working with other people.
One of the projects was to send white lawyers to sleep inside the office of the Black Panther Party in San Francisco. I think it may have been the only Black Panther office, major Black Panther office, that did not get attacked in that December of '69, because the police knew that these white lawyers were sleeping in the office. And if they attacked the office, they were going to hurt some white lawyers, and that was going to give them more headache than it was worth to them.
There's this quote attributed to J. Edgar Hoover. He said, "The National Lawyers Guild is more dangerous than the people who throw bombs." We give breathing space to the movement. We protect the movement, and that's why we're more dangerous. So you have to get rid of us so you can get rid of the movement.
You have to recall, I mean, we were living during a period where people were being killed all the time. All of us expected that at any time we might be charged with this or that and be dragged into jail or have to stand trial. Among our circles and a lot of people on the left, there was a lot of interest in the rights of prisoners and who prisoners were.
Steve was at the center in the 70s of the movement when he went out to visit George Jackson, and that exploded and has an impact on the world. What happened at Attica was part of the result of that.
From Soledad to San Quentin, a prison reform movement was growing, led by a young convict who had served 11 years for robbing a gas station, George Jackson.
Here in prison, we see the repression, the exploitation, the victimization of lower class people.
Steve was not actually representing George Jackson when he went to visit him in August of 1971. He had been visiting him that summer to collect information, to file a lawsuit against the Department of Corrections for its cruel and inhumane treatment of prisoners in the Adjustment Center. In the Adjustment Center, prisoners lived 23 and a half hours a day in lockdown. They had a half an hour for exercise. They were treated like animals. They were brutalized.
Stephen Bingham was like so many of today's young lawyers, angry at the injustices in the system, but committed to working within it for change. He organized Mexican-American farm workers in Central California, then went to work for a local anti-poverty office. The authorities believe he took that one last overcommitted act and tried to circumvent the system and smuggle a gun to George Jackson.
If I was incarcerated, I would probably get killed. I would be guarded by guards who believed that I was responsible for the death of these guards at San Quentin.
And then I get a phone call from Steve saying he needed help. He was so scared because there was no safe place. They were going to come at him from all sides, and he just needed to get away. The threat was immediate, it was imminent. And I contacted this woman who was able to get fake IDs for people because she had helped GIs who had been to Vietnam and didn't want to go back. So we arranged to meet him in Las Vegas.
They never investigated properly. They cleaned up the entire crime scene, so there was no independent opportunity to view the crime scene by the media and other people. So I was driven to the bus station in San Jose to go to Las Vegas to meet with some friends who were going to help me get papers under a different name. I was having a coffee waiting for the bus in an hour or two. And there's a gentleman sitting at the next table, and I'm looking at the newspaper that he's looking at, and there's this huge picture of me on the front page of the newspaper. I was trying to think carefully everything I did, because I was at risk at this point. I had very long hair. So I went into a barber shop to get my hair cut. And I thought, if I go in and try to get a crew cut, he's going to think, wow, that's peculiar. And then he's going to see the picture in the paper and whatever. So I just asked him to do a good trim. And once that was finished, I went around the corner to another barber shop and promptly asked him if he could cut my hair, because I wanted it to be much shorter. So I did it in two phases.
I met Steve in a seedy hotel, and we just said, what are we going to do to protect him? We gave him the ID, we dyed his hair, we trimmed his eyebrows, and then he left.
George and I were the same age, both 29. What different lives we were born into. For a young, headstrong, kind of tough kid growing up in Los Angeles with an unbelievable racist police force back in the 60s. It was almost inevitable that he was going to end up in jail. And of course, I'm growing up in my very privileged household in Connecticut and going to private schools. Would be hard-pressed to find in the inequality of America two situations more different.
George Jackson wasn't simply an extraordinary individual, which he was. He encouraged community and collective efforts and political education. It was really an eye-opening experience because I had been doing work around political prisoners for quite some time. But this was the first time I began to get a sense of the oppressiveness of prison life.
I was contacted about going in to meet with George and talk with him about filing a civil suit dealing with the conditions of detention in what San Quentin euphemistically calls the adjustment center. There was excessive shackling. There were 5 or 6 quiet cells where people would be thrown, where the toilet was just a hole in the floor and there wasn't any running water and they were just given a bucket. I mean, this is America. This is not South Africa. The prisons were completely segregated institutions. They were really California's apartheid.
Well, I was incarcerated under a term they called for one to life, where I could have done 1 year and been released. I've done 10. That's more time than anybody in the state has ever done on a 1 to life.
George Jackson had incredible influence through his book, Soledad Brother. I mean, the introduction was written by the famous French author Jean Genet. The book was an internationally famous book, and it's this book of letters, these powerful letters saying to the world, racism is being used to split prisoners and oppress them in the prisons. You have to open your eyes.
Lord, Lord, they cut George Jackson down. Lord, Lord, they laid him in the ground.
Jackson became an international symbol for the oppression and the racism in American prisons. And really importantly, he was bringing black and white prisoners together.
One of his lasting legacies has to do with the purpose of knowledge, the role of knowledge. And he, I think, exemplified how knowledge can be used in a radical and transformative way, how it can be used to change the world.
And we will raise our children to be like George Jackson, to live like George Jackson, and to fight for freedom as George Jackson fought for freedom.
His action was a political statement because he set the standard for all political prisoners. He took the only available avenue of redress against state murder. The state created the violent situation that exists in San Quentin today.
No way was this an escape attempt on this day. George Jackson runs from the adjustment center into the grounds. The walls are huge. There's no way he could get over a wall, plus there's snipers on the wall. A sniper shoots and kills him.
The district attorney told me there is hardly any doubt in his mind that Stephen was the instrument by which the gun was delivered to George Jackson. I don't know if that is true, but I had it in my mind that Steve could have been victimized or used as an instrument inadvertently.
have not reached it.
My purpose in coming to California were primarily to do what I could for Steve, perhaps increasingly with the sense of wanting him to feel that if he came out of hiding, that there was plenty of chance for his clearing himself.
Alf was a very, impressive, imposing fellow.
An interview was arranged.
Patrician could not be a more appropriate word. He was used to being in control and to having his way, having his say. And I think that it was very difficult for him, initially unpleasant, for him to have these young lefty punks who are in their middle 20s, obviously in charge, and not letting him be in charge.
I was concerned at the public image that was projected in the papers that day after the prison break. Though Steve's name was not yet mentioned, it was clear the authorities believed the pistol had been smuggled to Jackson by a lawyer who had seen him just before he produced the gun.
An investigation centering around radical attorney Stephen Bingham, grandson of a former U.S. senator.
As soon as Steve's name began to surface as the lawyer involved, I just simply couldn't believe it, and I felt at that time that it was some kind of conspiracy, but it was a conspiracy of the authorities to get at the lawyers that they found distasteful. I actually started collecting news articles, about 500, 600 pages. I came across articles in which, before the event, authorities were claiming that there were lawyers from the Lawyers Guild who were sneaking in articles and who were plotting with the prisoners, things that were just unsubstantiated. And as a result of that, I started an article which appeared in The Nation magazine about the inconsistencies in the stories presented by the authorities.
A couple days after Steve left, I was driving my car and came to a stoplight, and I saw a man look at me, take out a piece of paper, and starting to write my license down. I jumped out of the car and I said, "What are you writing?" And he said, "Nothing, nothing." I said, "You're writing my license plate down. What are you doing?" And he said, "I thought you were Stephen Bingham." And I said, "I'm not Stephen Bingham." He said, "I'm just trying to do my duty as an American, good American citizen." And I said, "Tear it up." And he tore it up. I was so sad for Steve, knowing that all over the country, people were looking for him.
The FBI started calling me and coming to my door and asking if I'd had any knowledge of Steve's whereabouts. And of course, I didn't have any knowledge. I couldn't imagine my brother carrying a gun into a prison. I assumed that he was innocent, as my parents did, and that somehow he'd been set up by the authorities.
Everybody was sort of horrified, but there was also a lot of kind of skepticism too on some parts of the family, wondering, well, why did he do this? Why did he leave? Why did he drop out?
I entertained the possibility that, in fact, he had done what he was accused of doing. It didn't seem like him, but he was a bit of a revolutionary. There were people in the family that at least say that they never entertained for an instant that he could be guilty. I was not one of them.
The story that was attached to it made it seem entirely improbable
For one thing, they never seemed to ever arrive at the right size of the gun. You know, at one time it was a little bitty gun, and another time it was a great big gun. I thought, oh, what gun are they talking about? Oh, come on.
We are satisfied now that it was brought in underneath a wig, and since we found the wig this morning, we can now tie in that there was help from the outside.
My whole life had changed. Out of survival instinct, I didn't reflect on that. I just had to think forward, think future. Here I was, Robert Boards. I had to invent an entire identity. An identity is not just a name and a picture and a passport. It's like, who am I? If you had no photo ID, you couldn't get a passport quickly. There was one exception, and that was that if there was a family emergency abroad, and somebody vouched for you, you could get a passport. A woman who I'd never seen, but was part of the movement, was willing to risk prosecution. She could have gone to prison for 5 years, and she was willing to step forward, wear a wig and look very different than who she was. And she flew across the country with me from Las Vegas to Philadelphia. She went all by herself to pick up the passport the next day. And she proposed if it didn't work, that it was better for her to be arrested and deal with the consequences than for me to be arrested. She didn't come back within a certain amount of time. It meant something horrible had happened, and I needed to just leave and invent Plan B, which I didn't have at that point.
My mother used to always sit at that end of the table with a coffee there or with her drink there, or sitting by the phone and always think every time it rang and just running to get it. Oh, that might be Steve.
Within this yellow frame house of American Revolution vintage, 65-year-old Sylvia Bingham raised Stephen, one of 4 children.
Mrs. Bingham, you said earlier that Steve was an advocate of nonviolence, and yet he is almost alleged to have been brought in a gun into this prison scene. Is that conceivable under any circumstances?
It is not conceivable to me. If Steve has been guilty of this is one thing, and I'm sure that he's able to take the consequences. But we are very anxious not to see him framed. I must say it reminds me of the summer Steve spent in Mississippi when I didn't know whether he'd have emerged alive or dead. And I hung on the phone and worried about him all the time.
Didn't it rain, children? Rain, oh yes. Didn't it? Yes, didn't it? You know it didn't it? Oh, yes, how it rained.
We hope to send into Mississippi this summer upwards of 1,000 teachers, ministers, lawyers, and students from all around the country.
The goal was to do voter registration work in freedom education schools. Seeing the 2 sides, all these white people going about their business as if they were living in the rest of the United States and living a perfectly normal life, when 3 miles away there were sharecroppers or people living on less than $600 or $700 a year, and they had absolutely no consciousness of it. The reality that the power structure was not responding to reasonable demands that were being put forth in a reasonable way. Mayors are saying, we call on law enforcement to stop it.
By definition, if you're in Mississippi working for civil rights, it's dangerous.
they're dead, I feel like they asked for it. They came here looking for trouble.
Yes, didn't it? Yes, didn't it? You know me, didn't it?
His father and mother were deeply worried. They have connections.
Move down the street. Everyone move down the street.
His father used those connections to talk to Senator Eastland from Mississippi about making sure his son did not get abused in some fashion.
The senator called the governor to see that nothing happened to a volunteer with important political connections. I had a frantic call from Steve. Daddy, what have you done?
In fact, he was concerned that law enforcement was not protecting any of us. Rather than providing protection, they could essentially make my life so miserable by having police around me 24 hours a day that I would leave the state. I did have some resentment towards my father. It was meddling in my life, even though it was well-meaning.
One of the dynamics that seemed to me about the Bingham family is that you're being told as a 7-year-old that you come from a family with a past. They had a role to play, and it's not just about their personal desires. They were going to change the world. He could not have missed the significance of him also stepping away from political missionaries with his grandfather, who rediscovered Machu Picchu, and then religious missionaries with his great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather, the first 3 Hiram Binghams. Each one of these generations up until Stephen had been wrestling with what it meant to be a Bingham in the world. And I think Stephen's vision, that also morphed over time, to not be the missionary, pull back from that hyper-charged vision of yourself relative to others as being subordinate and inferior.
At the end of the Mississippi summer, I went to Berkeley Law School. I dropped out of law school after the first year and went into the Peace Corps in Sierra Leone. Fairly quickly, I became disillusioned with the whole project.
The questions that Stephen was raising about his time in the Peace Corps helped him see that the liberalism that the Peace Corps embodied, that his father was a reflection of, was no longer working in the world.
I got the call from the Black Panthers. This investigator, Vendetta Anderson, was planning to take out drafts of a book George was in the process of finishing. My only purpose when I arrived there with her was to make sure she could get her visit with George. Vendetta was carrying a briefcase that had a tape recorder inside it. The warden denied the visit. Vendetta asked me to take the drafts of the book in to visit with him myself. We don't think there was any gun that any inmate or anyone brought in from the outside. We think it was an inside job. To understand how reasonable that was, there's context. The National Lawyers Guild itself was a targeted organization of the counterintelligence program of the FBI.
The FBI program, COINTELPRO, their counterinsurgency program to destroy the Panthers and other groups, was horrible.
In Chicago, they killed Fred Hampton. And Guild lawyers were at the site of the shooting that night, and they preserved the evidence. In Los Angeles, the Panthers called the home of some guild lawyers, young guild lawyers, from inside and said the police is surrounding us. And guild lawyers went and stood outside as witnesses, white guild lawyers.
I'm scared. I'm really scared. I cannot face the irreversibility of my situation. Can't face the hopelessness of going back. Can't face the prospect of always being alone. Can't face the fact of never having a family, never having children, never seeing family and friends again who are so important to me. Never being involved in the struggle in the way I was before.
I spent about a year and a half in Eastern Europe, mainly Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. Eastern Europe didn't participate in Interpol, and you could live in Eastern Europe very, very cheaply. I would move every week or two, just pretending I was a tourist arriving for the first time, because I felt uncomfortable staying in any place more than about 10 days.
I went to visit him in Hungary. His first reaction was discomfort, because as soon as I saw him, I leapt on him and hugged him, and he was into a security mode, which was understandable. Steve was unsettled. We talked about him stopping the running and finding a place to live and making a life for himself. So by the time we left, he had decided to move to Paris.
I have a little apartment, very cheap. I have a good chance to soon have a part-time job to sustain me. I'm in Paris, where there are things to do, people to meet. One is given life only once, and I don't want to die stupidly. But even less, I don't want to live stupidly. Thus the origin of my gut-level feeling that I'd rather die living than live dying.
Hello. Hi, Steve. Ciao, ciao. You're well. Patrick taught me how to paint, and I did to earn a living become a house painter, and which politically fit because we were trying to work with the working class, and I was learning to use my hands. Non, mais on va descendre par là. On peut faire ça? Parce que j'avais des amis qui donnaient une assez grosse somme, ils ont fait une collecte. Je ne sais pas qui a donné. On m'a jamais révélé parce que, en principe, c'était illégal d'aider quelqu'un qui s'enfuyait. Donc, ils ont exprès. Ils ne m'ont pas dit. Mais il fallait garder ça jusqu'à ce que je puisse commencer à travailler. À la limite, je prends un café de temps en temps. If I'm in some public place, I kind of like to face the entrance because I always had the feeling I wanted to see people coming if they were coming to get me and not I have a tap on the shoulder.
L'exil, c'est une situation extrêmement difficile. Dans l'exil, tout vous manque. Les odeurs, les sensations qui vous ont façonné, qui ont fait votre histoire, votre enfance, les liens avec la famille.
I did learn to close off my emotions to other people, because the horror of what I was living in could have very easily allowed all kinds of uncontrollable emotions to bubble to the surface. The danger is that I end up closing off emotions to myself, and not danger in the terms of security, but just the negative aspect of that in terms of who I am as a person.
Et c'était un personnage curieux parce qu'en fait, on ne savait pas son histoire. Mais personne n'avait imaginé qui il pouvait être, quoi.
J'ai eu la pulsion de lui demander « Alors, qu'est-ce que tu faisais aux États-Unis? Quel est véritablement ton métier et tes études ?»
Je crois qu'on était chez nous, il n'a pas voulu, il a pas voulu aller dans un lieu public, il n'a pas voulu aller dans un café. Je pense qu'il a vécu une période de grande solitude.
I'm tired. Just really tired. Playing games, saying things I don't believe, pretending I'm not what I am. I want to be me.
Goodness, it was Steve Bingham, a voice I had not heard for several years. And when I got the call prior to, I didn't know whether he was alive or dead.
I remember Henry Weinstein calling me, somewhat agitated, saying, I need to see you, Paul, as soon as possible. We met the next day at my office. He said, Paul, no one's heard from Steve Bingham for a couple of years. He contacted me. He wants to meet with me and me to write an article showing people that, one, I'm alive, and two, I'm doing good political work. And I don't want to go to jail.
And this was like August or late July of 1974. Nixon was convening grand juries around the country to go after basically anything left of center.
I said, Henry, if a grand jury is convened to get you to force you to give up where you met with Steve and where Steve was living, and you refuse, then you go to jail.
It was potentially a great story, but it was also potentially a number of months in jail, could be as long as 18 months.
It was a conscious tactic of the Nixon administration.
Once I made the decision that I was going to go, I let Paul know. Of course, I let Steve know, but I didn't tell anybody else. You know, I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell my closest friend. So I got into Toronto, and then I started looking around for a cheap hotel where no one would care who I was as long as I was able to pay the bill. And I found such a place. I don't know, maybe it's $10 a night.
And we met for a couple of days of interviews.
We were both very concerned about being followed, about possible surveillance. Just very concerned, understandably, about being tailed.
So we met in an empty stadium where there was a football team practicing. Henry was writing, and I was talking, and periodically the people on the football field would look up at us and sort of wonder what we were doing there.
All of the meetings were outside. ballparks, a restaurant, and it became clear that Steve was very concerned that if, God forbid, we were, some cop spotted us or something, or some FBI agent, and he was arrested, that I couldn't be charged with harboring a fugitive because we were in a public place. There were things he wanted me to know. I mean, the fact that he was alive, the fact that he was involved in political work wherever he was living, but there were things that he didn't want me to know that potentially could have created problems for me. I mean, if somebody had ever asked me, well, where's he living? I could say, I don't know. He wouldn't tell me where he was living. And I think I sort of felt like I couldn't look at myself in the mirror if I didn't do this. I would have sort of been second-guessing myself forever.
It became liberating emotionally to know that everybody on the planet who cared about me was somehow or other going to read this article that was on the front page of the New York Times.
Did he have any regrets about his decision to go underground without a trace of hesitation? Smiling broadly, he said, quote, no, unquote. People may think I've gotten into mysticism like Rennie Davis, or I'm quietly living out my life. In fact, the opposite's happened. It's been a very good and strong period for me. Growing, my involvement with struggle is stronger. There's a real joy from being alive, engaged at one level or another in revolutionary struggle, and the fellow friendship around that. When I got to San Francisco, I did not kiss the ground, but I breathed a deep sigh of relief. I entered the country. Nobody stopped me. The first thing I did was I went to see Paul before I went home to let him know that I was back and that things had, basically gone fine.
When the article appeared, I was greatly relieved. It meant that he hadn't been killed in Berkeley or Oakland back shortly after the incident at San Quentin.
Henry had done a really brave thing. It was like a blow against the Nixon administration. It was a blow against the prison officials who were trying to suppress the prison movement. Steve could have been any of us liberal and radical lawyers. If you intimidated the lawyers, and going after Steve was a huge intimidation, the prisoners would be isolated once again. So when we saw Henry's article, it was like, all right, we're fighting back.
Moi, j'ai connu Robert, en fait, à la faculté de Vincennes, qui était une faculté expérimentale, un petit peu comme la fac de Berkeley aux États-Unis, et qui était le résultat de la négociation des étudiants qui avaient fait donc les luttes de mai 68, occupé la Sorbonne, où il y avait eu énormément de manifestations en France, mais qui faisait écho aussi à tous les événements qui se passaient dans le monde autour de mai 68. Cette université expérimentale acceptait les étudiants salariés au même titre que les autres étudiants. Pratiquement une petite révolution. Et puis il y avait des étudiants qui venaient du monde entier.
A student could get a visa for a year, and Vincennes really didn't care what I was doing there, so I was a student for 10 years. After moving like a vagabond from place to place, finding Vincennes was a little like finding heaven on earth.
On était un groupe qui venait de 68, on était donc des gauchistes, on a donc fait plusieurs films, et un film sur le foncier, un film sur le vin, un film sur le crédit agricole. C'était un combat pour la justice sociale dans les campagnes, si vous voulez.
Et je faisais un cours le mardi soir qui s'intitulait Front paysan. Et il est venu me voir en me disant « Tout ce que vous faites me plaît tellement que j'aurais bien envie de faire les mêmes choses que vous. Est-ce que je pourrais partager votre travail ?» Et je crois que j'ai dû lui dire oui.
Every day of those 13 years, at some point, you open the door out of your little cocoon and you venture into a world where there's police, there's strangers, there's friends of the family that suddenly appear on the street corner. There's all these unexpected things that can potentially happen. I didn't trust anybody on a personal, emotional level, and I didn't share my story.
Président 1-1, première.
My earliest memories of Françoise are being in classes and her working on this film on University of Vincennes.
Mon camarade de classe et compagnon de travail, Philippe Auchard, il devait accompagner Steve pour un tournage pour son film Longwy et il n'est jamais venu au rendez-vous. Et un jour, Steve m'a téléphoné et il est tombé sur moi.
I asked her if she could come to do sound.
Le pays des trois frontières, c'est le pays haut. Dans la vallée de la Chienne, des usines des hauts fourneaux.
The thing that triggered my interest was this extraordinary union struggle in Longwy, which is a small steel producing town.
Le mois d'août, il va être fermé, complètement arrêté. Nous avons souhaité de changer la situation, mais je crois que pour nous, on ne peut pas espérer beaucoup de choses ici. Voilà.
On peut appeler ça, oui, un véritable désastre. Un abandon de la classe ouvrière, une liquidation d'un héritage. C'est une des tragédies. Et c'est Robert qui décide d'aller faire un film. Il y en a d'autres sans doute qui sont allés. Nous, on était sur d'autres fronts, si j'ose dire, mais c'est lui qui est allé. Parce qu'il faut être gonflé, il faut avoir du courage. Et donc, du coup, ce film est un acte majeur de courage et de détermination. Et donc, véritablement, il a décidé d'être lui-même. On sait que pour être original et avancer, faites soi-même.
And that was an amazing experience and also very scary because somehow the guards learned that there was a foreigner inside the plant filming, which was completely illegal. And the workers hid me in a broom closet. Here I am underground and I'm inside a factory and there's a guard looking for me. But I didn't panic because that was one of the things my living underground had taught me. I just sort of focused on the task of being quiet in the closet. The film was going to be a tool to get the government to invest in the steel industry in France to save it. I was attracted to Françoise, but because I thought she was linked with either Philippe or Patrick, it never occurred to me that I might date her.
On était trois dans un appartement et Philippe nous a rejoints ce week-end-là. Et ce matin-là, je me souviens, je lui avais apporté mon sac de couchage et on dormait par terre, je dormais dans le salon. Et ce matin-là, quand Philippe n'était pas encore levé, il est venu de bonne heure et il m'a embrassée. Et ça a été le début de... Ça m'a absolument séduit qu'il ose. Parce que je ne pensais pas que c'était le genre de type à faire ça, quoi. Il était un peu distant.
Steve was so poor in France. He was a working class guy, a house painter. And I remember having a picnic with him in the park. He would eat his sardine, you know, Steve was very cheap. And he was covered with plaster, and we would have a picnic there.
Françoise and I were together for a full year before I finally said to myself, this is different and I want to share who I am. I was sort of scared because it could have gone in two directions. I've been lying to her for a year.
Moi, je me souviens très bien. Et ça a pris toute la journée. Enfin, on était assis sur la pelouse. Là, il m'a dit qu'il n'était pas Robert Borst. Et la première réaction, je pense, je lui ai dit, ah ben j'aime pas ce prénom de toute façon. J'ai rigolé. Et là, il s'est mis à parler du contexte des Panthères noires et ce qui s'était passé.
Ever since the day I left, I contemplated in some deep recess of my mind the consequences of what might happen if sometime I had a trial and I was found guilty. I mean, that was always in my mind.
Back home, our family was closely following the 1975 trial of 6 prisoners accused of murder for the violent events of August 1971. We called it the San Quentin 6 trial, but the official name was more haunting: The People versus Stephen Bingham.
The trial was named after the key defendant who was absent. We had no idea who this guy Bingham was, but that we believed that whatever it was that happened, it was nobody's fault. It wasn't George Jackson. It wasn't Steve. It was the system. We weren't the notorious people in the adjustment center. We were the extras to a drama, to a scenario, to a story that climaxed that particular day.
The San Quentin 6 trial was a living example of racism in action. In the courtroom, Johnny Spain was chained and he was unable to move. The defendants were treated as dangerous animals. They were not treated as human beings.
This was exactly what we feared. Trials that were heavy on theater and convictions, but fell short on protecting the legal rights of the accused.
Ça m'a transi au début quand il m'a raconté cette histoire, qui était la personne, un des hommes les plus doux que j'avais rencontrés de ma vie. Ma première réaction, ça a été de dire, mais si tu es accusé de faire ça, il faut absolument que les gens sachent que tu ne l'as pas fait. Et il faut absolument que... il faut se rendre, il faut faire quelque chose. Tu ne peux pas vivre le reste de ta vie comme ça, à Paris, à être peintre en bâtiment. Déjà, c'était une vie super marginale.
I'd continually assess the situation in the States in terms of when would be a time when I would be able to go home and feel safe.
We were often reminded of Steve's absence by the clicking phone lines and the dark cars parked across the street, a constant warning that our family was under FBI surveillance.
Word was brought to us in person by one of Steve's former housemates that he would be able to make a rendezvous with Sylvia and me within the next month or so.
The idea of meeting with my parents was scary and freaked my friends out, freaked me out. So what we eventually did is I pushed on the question and we set it up through Gary Bello, one of the few people that my parents really trusted. And Gary somehow got my parents out on the lawn because we didn't know if the house was bugged, and basically said, you have a chance to see Steve. But you have to come right now. You're not allowed to make any phone calls or do anything. Get in my car, and we're going to go to the ferry and go to Long Island.
He followed a very circuitous and roundabout route in downtown New London, as he explained, to throw off any possibility of our being trailed. Eventually, we arrived at the terminus of the Long Island Ferry. He warned me to stay as much out of sight as possible while he went to get tickets. We enjoyed the 2-hour ferry ride across Long Island Sound, hardly daring to believe we might soon see Steve. After an hour's drive, we pulled into a motel where a cabin had been reserved for us. In the cabin, we sat expectantly. Finally, there was a knock at the door, and Steve stepped out of the darkness.
So we met for about 4 hours, and it was, as you can imagine, it was pretty emotional. One of the things I wanted was to tell my mother that I would have connected with her earlier, but because of Daddy, everybody just felt it wasn't safe.
I'd been afraid that being a fugitive would have hardened him, but he was his old gentle self, although it seemed he showed a new firmness and self-confidence.
I had 2 little stones that I'd picked up on a beach somewhere, I think in France. And I gave one to each of them just as something concrete that they could kind of hold on to. So when they woke up in the morning, they would know it had not all just been a dream. I reassured them that there was a finite point in time that was coming to an end.
He rose and said he had to go, and after a tearful goodbye, we saw him go out the door and disappear in the darkness.
Those few short hours in Long Island were the last moments my uncle had with his mother. 3 years later, she was dead.
I think it was after my mother had died that I really began talking with Françoise about finally going home.
Même en sachant qu'il y aurait un temps, entre parenthèses, en retournant aux États-Unis puisqu'il y avait le temps de la prison, parce qu'il aurait fallu qu'il ait sa vraie identité pour se marier. Et en ayant sa vraie identité, il était fiché quand même ici en France.
I never heard my name spoken. I never said my name. I remember when I finally decided to come back, walking to Vincennes, and I'm out in the middle of the forest, and I decided I really needed to just say my name, psychologically, just to hear my name, and I modulated my voice, and I said, Stephen Bingham, Stephen Bingham, Stephen Bingham, Stephen Bingham, Stephen Bingham.
Stephen Bingham reappeared today after 13 years on the run from the law.
On the advice of his attorney, Bingham declined to say where he's been living or what he's been doing the past 13 years.
We couldn't have him arrested as a fugitive. That would really hurt the case. The whole idea was surrender, showing your faith in your innocence. Let's walk over to Glide Church. Glide Church is this nationally famous progressive church. And one of the lawyers knew the minister at Glide Church, and he arranged for Steve and Francois to sleep in Glide Church the night before we surrendered.
I'm real happy to be back. My politically active life has always been dedicated to the idea that change can come about without violence, that violence tends to poison otherwise good motives. This sympathy I want to express to the families of those killed, that day is not gratuitous, it is very real. So is my innocence. You must understand I was very afraid. I decided finally to leave when 1 week later I heard that there was conclusive evidence
quote unquote, pointing to my knowing participation. I knew that such evidence did not exist and could only have been invented. They hooked me into the jail in a single cell because they were so afraid that something might happen to me, because shit happens in jails. I was greeted by the inmates, "Hey, did you bring my gun in for me?" Bail was set at $500,000, which is the equivalent today of $2 or $3 million.
Il y a une personne, voilà, je vais vous annoncer, peut-être que vous le savez, mais en tout cas, ça m'étonnerait, qu'il y a un article consacré à Robert Borges, qui n'est pas Robert, mais qui est Steve. Je découvre en 2 pages ce que j'ignorais totalement. J'étais en colère un peu. Robert était là depuis longtemps avec vous. C'était un frère, au fond. Il avait rencontré Françoise, qui était une de mes étudiantes, et c'était une famille, tout ça. Et du coup, ce qu'il a fait avec nous, je l'ai compris à ce moment-là, n'était que dans le prolongement de ses engagements aux États-Unis. C'est ça qui était très beau. Donc, nous avions hébergé, nous étions au travail avec une personne qui était fidèle à ses idées.
J'allume la télévision, les informations. La première chose que je vois, c'est Robert. Il ressemblait vraiment.
Je me rappelle, je prends une douche et puis j'ai Bernie qui m'appelle de la chambre en me disant « Jean-René, viens voir, Jean-René, viens voir ».
Avec un papa à côté, avec des gens, et qui passaient... il était... Voilà, il passait devant des gens et on disait « le fugitif se rend ».
Elle a entendu Steve parler à un moment donné dans un autre plan où elle a vu Steve en costume, où elle n'avait jamais vu Steve habillé si bien en costume.
Et là, vraiment, j'ai dit « ça y est, tu vois, c'était un criminel ». C'était vraiment...
Et on était stupéfaits. Alors là, c'était... Si c'est pas possible, quoi, c'est pas lui, mais si, c'est lui. Et Françoise avait un visa, mais qui était provisoire. Ils n'étaient pas mariés. Et pour pouvoir rester avec Steve, puisque désormais il s'appelait Steve, et donc ils ont décidé de se marier. C'était pour elle la seule façon d'avoir le visa. Et comme on était là, donc on a fait un mariage qui était très discret, très émouvant en même temps.
Oui, très très beau.
Bingham will likely face all the original charges, 1 count of conspiracy, 5 counts of murder.
We were concerned that for many juries, just the question of how else could it have happened, if not with Steve Bingham's participation, would be sufficient to get a conviction. And I carried that fear throughout the whole trial.
By charging me, they never investigated the incident. We came across dozens and dozens of names of people who'd had contact with Jackson that day who had never interviewed.
So we had a preliminary hearing. And at the time, it was the longest preliminary hearing in California history. There was 50 witnesses, there was 250 exhibits. It went on and on.
From my perspective, sitting in on the prelims, they didn't go that well. The prosecution seemed to be really organized, and the kind of feeling in the courtroom from those of us who were watching was, gee, this isn't going as well as we would like.
Given all those facts in Mr. Bingham's flight, I think that there is proof of his guilt.
And so we will have to wait for Bingham's trial to see if there are new facts on that bloodiest day in San Quentin history, and if those facts are not compelling, or if Bingham is wrong about the new mood in America, he could find himself behind the same walls where George Jackson died 13 years ago.
The prosecution had on its face a very strong circumstantial evidence case. Steve goes to a visit with George Jackson. Right after the visit, George takes control of the adjustment center and then people are killed and wounded.
So the prosecution's theory was Steve smuggled a gun in through a tape recorder. The problem with that theory is that the tape recorder went through a metal detector and was searched by the guard. The other problem with that theory is Steve never intended to take a tape recorder. He was there with a private investigator. She had the tape recorder. He wasn't even going to take it in. The guard said to him, "Aren't you going to take the tape recorder in?" And at the preliminary hearing, Lenny Weinglass did a really nice job in cross-examination of the guard, establishing those facts.
Hey, you're cool.
The defendant, Mr. Bingham, George Jackson, and others conspired to commit one or two crimes. That conspiracy resulted in the deaths, the murders of Frank P. De Leon and Jer Graham.
People had come together and formed a support committee.
I had 2 buttons made that everybody was handed out to everybody. One of them was "Welcome home, Steve," and the other was "Not guilty."
There were supporters in the courtroom for him every day.
Having people in the courtroom changes the dynamic amazingly.
So you may be wondering, how come Stephen Bingham ended up being charged with conspiracy and murder?
The opening statement was an incredibly nerve-wracking experience. I was, of course, very nervous, and my hands were sweating, and I was holding the gun to try to explain that the size of this gun, the shape of it, the weight of it, it would have been impossible for George Jackson to have walked the length of a football field between the visitor room and the adjustment center while balancing this object on his head, even if he had had a wig.
The diagram that I'm now putting up.
Depending upon which side was speaking, the prosecution or the defense, you'd go home that night thinking, well, of course it had to have happened this way, and then the next day you'd be swayed the other way.
Their theory of the case was essentially it couldn't have happened any other way than Steve smuggling the gun into him. Because the guard who had examined the tape recorder, his recollection of the size of these objects changed over time. Things got bigger and bigger. The gun didn't fit in the tape recorder.
Jerry put it up on a chalkboard. He drew one box, and then there was a box bigger, and then a box bigger than that, and there were 4 boxes. And a graphic thing like that put up on the blackboard pretty much demolished his testimony.
We were able to get across the theory that the government was looking for a scapegoat because George Jackson's death was a national, if not an international event, and the government had to find some sort of theory that would turn the spotlight away from what was going on in the prison and what was going on in the solitary confinement of the adjustment center. And Steve was a scapegoat.
The only real argument that the DA had in this corner was that I fled. And there wasn't a whole lot that could be done around that because we agreed I fled. And I came back to be acquitted. After the multitude of witnesses and exhibits were presented, Terry Boyne got me to admit that I lied when I was getting my passport, and I lied when I was telling people my name was Robert Bortz, and everything that was personal was a lie, and so you're a liar.
No one else left. No one else obliterated their identity. Why run if you're innocent?
And the darkest day of the trial was when guards who had been taken hostage and had their throats slit but survived testified. It was horrific, horrific testimony. After court that day, Steve's dad wanted to have dinner with me. He wanted me to talk to the prosecutor about trying to negotiate some kind of plea bargain. You know, as a father and a grandfather, I can't imagine what it was like for him to be there every day and listen to all of that testimony, knowing that his son could get convicted and go to prison for the rest of his life. But I told Mr. Bingham, we're going to win. We're going to win. I told the jurors, this trial is not about 1986, it's about 1971. And you had to understand what life was like and what the political environment was like in 1971 to understand why Steve and his friends thought he had to leave. But that jury was out for a week.
Which was nerve-wracking for all of us. Because we thought if they're going to acquit him, they're just going to go in there and vote for acquittal and come out. And every day that they deliberated and they didn't rush out with a not guilty verdict made us more and more nervous. So I wasn't eating or sleeping.
I was so scared I didn't go to court. I just thought how horrible it would be to visit Steve in prison for the rest of my life and his life.
Ever since the day I left, I contemplated in some deep recess of my mind the consequences if I was found guilty.
We did not really want to think about the worst, of course, because you are paralyzed by the idea.
You know, which door of that courtroom was he going to walk out of?
Stephen and I had gone up to the roof. It was lunchtime, and a guard came up and said, you know, Mr. Bingham, there's a verdict, and you need to come back to the courtroom.
I remember seeing one of the press people running down the hall, and the jury's back, the jury's back, and he actually said, and we think the verdict's guilty, and all of us turned white. I mean, Francoise totally turned white. Everybody just froze.
I was sitting next to Alf and Kitty, you know, on the second row. When the jurors came up, we all, you know, took each other's hand and pressed, you know, like crazy because it was so tense and we didn't know what to expect. And
We, the jury, in the above entitled case, find the defendant, Stephen Mitchell Bingham, not guilty.
I don't have any words. I've waited 15 years for this day.
We're all of us just thrilled with the verdict, but also the significance of the case is that it's okay to care about what goes on inside California's prisons.
I think the prosecution persisted after all these years because they wanted to paint everybody with the same brush. Violent and, you know, not valuing human life. And what we felt was our movement was quite the opposite. The support for Steve was not just a support for him as an individual, but a support for our movement. It wasn't about killing people. That was what the police did. It wasn't about tearing things up. It was about building a better world. So when Steve was acquitted, it was an affirmation of our world, not their world.
just to be open and, you know, go on with a normal life, not to have this big worry in our life. It's going to make such a difference.
I certainly feel that 13 years underground and 2-year trial has defined me to other people. But it's not who I am.
You know, everything changed after the verdict because, first of all, Steve, he was himself again, and we were able to, you know, start a family. I mean, we didn't really expect to have a baby so soon, but we turned out we had a baby 9 months exactly after when the verdict came out. We named our child Sylvia because of his mother. So Sylvia was the acquittal baby, born on Earth Day, 1987.
I had a firm which specialized in pension law, and I offered him a job, so he started working with us, and he worked very well. He was a good lawyer.
I really appreciate that they did that because that's what allowed me to become a lawyer again. But my life has been working with low-income people who really get screwed by the system. So in 1990, I went to work for Bay Area Legal Aid. The Social Security, which has representative payees that help people, and it's required under law when they have a drug addiction problem, those people receive the money and they help the client manage their funds. We could talk about
That's what we are talking
No,
about.
we're not. We're
Yes, we
talking
are.
about giving all of the rent money to a landlord. We're not talking about a program that would permit, with dignity, someone to work out with a representative payee what's the best way to spend the money.
We were doing this work in very hostile environments. We were dealing with the backlash of the 1960s and 70s. We were dealing with the rise of Ronald Reagan and his coalition that was fundamentally pushing back against the advances that people had made.
We had to develop credibility both in the community and with the institutions here in San Francisco, and Steve was very instrumental in all of that and inspired me to believe in possibilities and to, you know, start with the seed of an idea and dedicate yourself to seeing that idea, you know, bear fruit, you know, deepen your roots in the community and always maintain a sense of fairness and rightness, not necessarily righteousness, but rightness in the work that you were doing. And as long as Steve was in the room, we felt that the law was indeed on our side.
One of the things we talk about, and it'd be really helpful to somehow systematically keep track of people's...
He could have used a celebrity status and risen to some kind of position of prominence among folks who find that to be important. But he is not looking for that. He makes a contribution by being part of a movement, by being part of the discussion, and accepting collective responsibilities, accepting the ability to work with other people.
We also have to educate the community that if you get cited and released, you better show up in court, which if you're undocumented is kind of scary, because then if you don't show up, then a warrant for your arrest.
Steve taught me what it means to be a movement lawyer, how to listen to the people on the ground, and how a lawyer can fit into that kind of organizing.
Sylvia, show me your style. Don't go over there too much, sweetie. It makes me a little nervous. Ooh, that was nice.
Steve, I think he projected all his dream, you know, in Sylvia. And she turned out to be a wonderful young woman.
It is called a ghost bike, an all-white bicycle often placed near the spot where a rider is killed. This bike on Prospect Avenue is for Sylvia Bingham, the 22-year-old California native struck and killed Tuesday while riding her bike to work.
Sylvia Bingham started working at Hard Hatted Women in Cleveland just August 24th.
She's the best of what we see in young people.
For her parents, the loss of this child who wanted so much to give back to the world is beyond words.
The world is not made for parents to die after their children, so there is nothing, just nothing to compare this to.
losing Sylvia was an amazing trauma for us. I think there's nothing worse in this world than having a child and losing her so young. I think that she survives in young people's spirit, you know, very political, very interested in changing the world. Because of this tragedy, we tend to pay more attention to what young people are doing around us. The fact that Sylvia passed away the way she did really changed Steve's perspective politically. He became interested in making a greener world and in the cause of people choosing a mode of transportation that is greener.
The skills that I had developed living underground in a peculiar kind of way helped me deal with losing Sylvia. Life throws incredible shit at you, and you better learn to deal with it, because otherwise your life falls apart.
His way of surviving is always to try to fight.
We call him Father Time, right? Because he's ageless.